I'm delighted to welcome Professor Shailendra Raj Mehta from India, from the Indian Institute of Management, where he's currently a visiting professor. He's a distinguished scholar, not merely in management, but he's also a Sanskritic scholar with tremendous knowledge in history. And he does work on the history of universities and knowledge production centers. He's also associated with the Duke Corporate Education. It's a sort of a consortium between that's been spun out of the Duke Fuqua School of Business, the LSE, I imagine, and IIM Ahmedabad. Previously, he taught at Purdue University for several years. He taught economics, and his research has been in the areas of entrepreneurship, industrial organization, information economics, and experimental economics. Interestingly, his research on synthetic economics or economies, which is framed using agent-based methods, is extensively used by Homeland Security in the United States now. So he's a technical and mathematical wizard as well. Shailendra has a bachelor's and master's from Delhi University. He has an M.Phil from Balliol, Oxford, which I would have thought was the #1, but then, but he also has a Ph.D. in economics from Harvard University. Without taking any time more, I leave the stage to Shailendra for his talk.
Thank you. Thanks, Pawan. Thanks for the kind words. This is happy stomping ground for me. It's always good to be back here. And essentially, I'm going to be talking about a topic that certainly is very close to my heart because of my roots here, right? But it was prompted by really my view of my question basically as to why is it that American universities are so good? We all know that they are. But what is not so clearly recognized is that they're disproportionately good. That is to say, no country has ever dominated any industry in recent times the way America dominates higher education. So it's a puzzle. And when I say that, let me actually just jump in and actually share with you some numbers, right? There's a reason why I'm taking 2010 and 11 numbers. This is for comparability, but the more recent data is exactly the same. If you look at, and I'm using Shanghai Jiaotong rankings because they're from Asia, because the claim has been made that American rankings, favor American schools and European rankings favor European schools. So use the Asian rankings, right? So here, if you look at this, 17 of the top 20 universities in the world are American. Now, this is extremely surprising. This is the puzzle that I had in my mind. Why is it that American universities are so good? And the way in which I will structure the talk is I will essentially, I can speak for a long time. I've been passionate about this for some time, but I will essentially have about half an hour of material. I have a lot more that I can pull up, but the rest I would like to sort of leave for interaction. So please feel free to interject at any point. I'd be delighted to have this conversation. In the end, we will also, if necessary, I can take an even longer view of how the history of universities basically has evolved over time. I mean, how universities as an institution have evolved over time. So happy to do that as well. And in fact, this is part of a broader study which looks at essentially the evolution of universities. Most people don't realize that it was, the concept of the university was invented in India. And for 1800 years, from 5th century BC to roughly 12th century AD, the best universities were in India. Then Europe basically takes over for about 700 years. And for the past 100 years, it is the United States, basically, which has had it. This is part of a broader study. So this slide I will not talk about, but just in case you're kind of interested, I argue in a broader work, of which what I'm presenting today is a part, that there are roughly 15 or so major or 16 major academic innovations that a great modern university sits on, and many of them basically were actually invented in Asia, in India in particular, in a very interesting social and a cultural context that I won't talk about it unless you have some questions. I'll be happy to talk about it. And then all of this system was destroyed literally in a 3-month period by the barbarian invasions. 1197 is when this happened. And interestingly enough, that was also the year in which Oxford was basically coming up. Amartya Sen makes this point, that literally in the same year that Nalanda and Takshila and Vikramshila, not Takshila, Takshila was destroyed earlier, Nalanda, Vikramshila, Udantapuri, Sompura, Gunshila, all of these were universities in that part of the world, all destroyed in 1 3-month period, and the whole knowledge production system in that part of the world was completely destroyed. And India never really recovered, basically, from that. And it's still in the process of recovery. So anyway, I won't talk about this in any great detail, but the 3 questions that I will talk about today, specifically in the next half an hour or so, and feel free to interrupt me at any time, are these. Why are American universities so good? Why is Harvard so good? And in particular, how did so many new American universities get so good so fast? And I'll give you the answer right away. There is no mystery in my mind to it. It has to do with the whole new model of governance, basically, that was pioneered in the United States, and in particular by Harvard. And as I will talk about some of that institutional history, which certainly was not known to me, and even today is not known to many people here in this university, in this great university. So I'll talk about that. And essentially look at both contemporary data as well as historical time-dependent data, or path-dependent data on this. So, yeah, so what does it take to create a great university? Phil Altbach at Boston basically tells the story that John D. Rockefeller asked Charles Eliot here at Harvard, what does it take, because he wanted to endow a great university. And Eliot basically famously said that it takes $50 million and 200 years, right, to create a great university. This was back in the 1880s. But interestingly enough, yet with slightly more than 50 million that Rockefeller personally endowed, the University of Chicago became one of the top universities in the world in just a couple of decades. And then, strangely enough, because they did not keep up with the institutional innovation, at one point they were better than Harvard in terms of their graduate programs in the early 20th century. Many of their departments are actually far superior. They were setting the standard. But there were some things that they did which caused them to fall back. I'll come back to that if there is interest. But so basically, the University of Chicago also becomes very good very quickly. Today, actually, let me just skip this. Traditional answers as to why that is the case, right? As to why these universities are so good are these, right? And these answers I've taken from Henry Rosowski's famous book, The University and the Owner's Manual. The traditional answers are it's because of national wealth, a large population, government research support, the constructive influence of refugees who came in from Europe, the American habit of private philanthropy, fierce competitiveness, tenure, and unitary governance. So literally a complete rag bag of things, basically, that in some sense characterize the higher education system in the United States, right? Now, my point is that every one of these answers has merit in it, but is inadequate as a full explanation of why America is so good. In particular, yes, America is large, but at the end of the day, it's only a quarter of the world's GDP, right? So if you look at the GDP of the world, about 60 trillion US dollars. The US is about 15 trillion. It's a large population, but it's 5% of the world population. It has government support for research, but there are other countries which have lots of support. Constructive influence of Hitler refugees. This is an interesting one. Because while, yes, it benefited a lot from the migration, as it continues to benefit, from the migration of talent from around the world, and just looking around this room is enough example. You have enough examples here as well. But that said, let us not forget that Princeton as an academic center was famous a lot before Einstein moved to the Institute for Advanced Study with an appointment at Princeton. In fact, he had been given an honorary degree, and he had been he had visited earlier and had lectured extensively at Princeton, and that was one of the reasons why he chose Princeton, because he was familiar with Princeton. So the point is, yes, Einstein, added a lot to Princeton, but Princeton was already quite famous before Einstein came. And similarly, the American habit of private philanthropy, yes, this is a big one, because this allows, if you look at Harvard's endowment, it's mostly philanthropic donations. But why does this happen? And this I will come to, so I'll park this particular explanation in a minute. Fierce competitiveness of American universities, this again is something which is a consequence of something more fundamental that I'll come to. And tenure that can easily be copied, unitary governance. Also, unitary governance basically means that the board appoints the president, and the president has complete control over all non-academic matters. So in academic matters, the faculty basically reigns supreme, so academic freedom rules. But on all non-academic matters, the president basically has full control. So that unitary governance, the fact that there is a clear chain of command, Henry Rosowski calls this a unique American innovation, which indeed it is. But this is also easy to copy, right? There's no actual reason why this can't be copied. So the question is, what else is the answer? So let me show you a table, which, and by the way, this data had not been collected before for some strange reason, I don't know why. But my hunch was that it has to do with how these universities are governed. So if you look at this table, I'm just showing you 20 of the 102 data points that I have. So it took me a year to get this data, but I went and looked at the board composition of the top 100 US universities on the US News and World Report rankings. Why 102? Well, actually there were 103. There was a tie for the 99th place. There were 4 universities which were tied for 99th place in 2011. And I reached out and basically got data from 102 of them. One of them basically refused, absolutely, to part with this data. They said that we don't give any information on a matter of principle about our trustees. The others, by and large, could be persuaded or already had this information in the public domain, so I could get it. And I'm showing you the top 20 here. Now look at this data. With one exception, every one of these, and that's Caltech, every one of these is about 50%. If you look at the top 5, 3 out of the top 5 are 100%. In terms of percentage of alumni on the board, that is, I just look at the total number of trustees, and I look at the number of alumni amongst the trustees, and just the percentage. So if you look at Harvard in particular, it's 100%, Princeton is 90%, Yale is 100%, Columbia now is 100%, and so on down the line. And by the way, if you look at the others, it's still predominantly alumni run. The only exceptions are for an interesting historical reason. Those are exceptions like the University of California system, the State University of New York system, and some of the other state systems where they have one board for many universities. So for example, the Board of Regents of the University of California is the board of trustees for all 10 UC universities, right? All 10 universities in the state of California, all 10 state universities have a common board. So very clearly it is not possible for alumni of any one institution to dominate a board which looks at 10 institutions, right? So modulo that, so if you leave out those institutions, even the public and the religious institutions tend to be run by the alumni. So take, for example, the University of Michigan, right? It has 8 trustees, and they're actually elected in the same way that the governor is elected, that is by the population as a whole. It's very odd that the state of Michigan elects the trustees by a common vote for the University of Michigan. 5 of the 8 are University of Michigan alumni. Purdue, most of them are appointed by the governor or some other public process. 9 out of 10 are alums. Berkeley, I don't have the number here, but 30% of the board of trustees of the regents of the board of the California system are alumni of Berkeley. And most of the rest are alumni of one or the other of the UC system, UCLA, UC San Diego, UC Davis, etc., etc. So that is the exception, so to speak. But all of those still are part of the data set, and I will talk about that in a minute. Any questions so far? Okay. Now, very interesting history. Now, again, most people don't realize this, but Harvard was a government university. It was not a private university, it was a public university until 29th of April, 1865. And something very interesting happened at that time, which made the state to turn over this university to the alumni. The first time that this had happened to any university, and I'll tell you why it happened in a minute. But this was just a couple of weeks. I mean, I'm sure all of us here have seen the Lincoln movie. This was just a few weeks after the conclusion of the American Civil War. And this, I argue, is the turning point in Harvard's history, which marks its emergence in the global academic world. And very quickly, this spreads across the US. First, Yale copies it, and then College of William and Mary, and then pretty much most universities basically follow that. A couple of them are late to the party. Columbia in particular, and I'll talk about that in a minute, is pretty interesting. But some of them are late to the party, but then this is pretty much the dominant form. So how did this come about? Now here is a table. There's an obscure paper that I found, which came out a couple of years ago, from the Harvard Library Bulletin, of all places, right? This was published, I think, about 20 years ago, where somebody went to the Harvard archives and actually looked at the composition of the voting members of the board, right? Because the board was, and from 1710 onwards, the interesting thing is that the percentage of Harvard alumni on the board was almost always above 50, except that it took a big dip around the mid-1800s. Now, first of all, why were Harvard alumni so prominent on the board, even when it was a government university? Any ideas? Why was it
government too?
Sorry?
Because they were also the government?
They were also the government. Essentially, it was the most prominent college in the United States, right, being the earliest. Essentially, the Harvard legislature had a preponderance of, the Massachusetts legislature had a preponderance of Harvard alumni. Mostly graduates of the law school and of the divinity school. Mostly from those two areas, right? So essentially, when the state was appointing, when the legislature was appointing the board, they mirrored, so to speak, the composition of the legislature itself. So that worked fine for Harvard until the 1800s. And then, of course, as you know, the big immigration happens because of the potato famine in Ireland. The Irish immigration and the European immigration begins. And here I have the percentage growth of the population by decade. And as you can see, the Irish are coming. And the Europeans are coming. And the immigrants are coming. And so essentially, now the composition of the legislature changes. It's no longer the elite Harvard alums, right? And essentially, as you can see, the debate starts to happen. And the questions that the legislature, with the new composition, asks are, why are you so elitist? Why do you admit so few people? Why do you charge so much? Why do you teach the wrong subjects? And essentially, they start for a period of 20 years in the 1840s. Huge pressure starts to be brought on Harvard. They start to cut off funding. It was still supported to some extent by the state. Furthermore, private funding that came in through the alumni was also sequestered. there was a grant of $50,000, which was a big amount in those days, in the 1840s, that was essentially just stopped. And then all hell broke loose. I mean, the state is not giving money, the alumni money is not being allowed to reach the university. And then the final straw was that the legislature steps in and stops the appointment of the president of Harvard. They stop a couple of faculty appointments, and the president's appointment is also stopped. And I document all this in great detail in the paper, and happy to send it to you, those of you who have interest. So it is stopped. And essentially, the university, the business of the university is becoming very, very difficult. And at that point, President Hill basically President Hill writes a letter to the legislature and says, if you want to kill us, kill us. I mean, we are yours. We are a public institution. Kill us if you like. But if you want us to thrive, and this handwritten note that he sent to the legislature has been discovered in the archives, and I quote from it in the paper. He says, but if you want the best interest of the university at heart, turn us over to those alumni who are distinguished and who care about us. And this passes just barely on the 29th of April, after 2 years of intense lobbying. This passes by 2 votes in the Senate, in the state Senate, and by 1 vote in the House. Also, it's just a couple of weeks after the end of the Civil War. Harvard's sons, and in those days it was only sons, basically served with distinction in the Civil War. So there was a lot of goodwill that Harvard had generated. And capitalizing on that goodwill, and capitalizing on the fact that there was this intense lobbying, which also worked in its favor, the measure passes. But remember that it passes barely. It almost did not pass. And this is one of those curious happenstances in the history of institutional development where things could have gone the other way. And this is such a singular development, if you like, in the history of institutions, that it could have gone either way. And I just shudder to think what the character of Harvard today would be if it were not run by the alumni, and if the state basically was still running it. By the way, the state puts in a caveat. When it turns it over to the alumni, it says you're not going to change some salient features. By the way, Harvard is specifically listed in the Massachusetts state constitution. There's a whole section which is devoted to the college in Cambridge, as it is called. It's not called Harvard, it's called the college in Cambridge. A whole section, I believe section 8 of the Constitution of Massachusetts, is dedicated just to Harvard, and it says what Harvard may or may not do. In particular, it says that if you change anything about the board structure, we can take you over again. So one highly dysfunctional feature of Harvard's functioning, which it has tried to get out of, is that it has 2 boards, the board of the Harvard Corporation and the Board of Overseers. And it's very dysfunctional to have 2 boards, to have 2 masters, as it were. They've been trying to get rid of it, but they can't. Because immediately, the folks across the river can say, hang on a minute, we are coming back. So that's a risk. I'm told that I've had some interesting conversations about this with Henry Rosowski, whose work I also build upon. And this is a very real fear, that if Harvard messes, even in the direction of cleaning up some old baggage, if it messes up any of this, it can be taken over. So anyway, so this is now very interesting. So my thesis is the following: that it is alumni governance basically, and if you look at the sample of the top 100 US universities, the percentage of alumni on the board is 63%. Even if you take some of the outliers like Berkeley and the New York system and the California system, where because of this institutional constraint, the percentage of alumni control cannot be very high. But barring those, almost all institutions in the United States in the top 100 are essentially run by the alumni. And my thesis is, and I'll basically just show you the data, the statistical regressions on this. My thesis is, the higher the percentage of alumni on the board, the higher are the three measures of quality. The higher the endowment, the higher the selectivity, and the higher the rank on the US News and World rankings. Right? So that is my thesis. And interestingly enough, Columbia was the richest university in the United States well into the 1880s. It was not Harvard. But Columbia had basically faculty governance. It was run by the faculty, not by the board, until 1908. And so what did the faculty do with the massive endowment, the New York lands and the rent from New York lands which Columbia had? They ate it. So I document in the paper that in 1880, a Harvard professor, the average salary was $2,500 a year. In today's dollars, $125,000 in terms of purchasing power parity. A Columbia professor paid himself, and it was mostly himself in those days, 3 times as much, $7,000. Can you imagine? $375,000 in today's money. So this is what bad governance does. And by the way, under the law, no faculty member of any kind can serve, no civil servant of any kind can serve on the board of Harvard. It's a very interesting caveat. And certainly this is what, and Columbia didn't have that. And it was essentially run by the faculty until they had to succumb to the logic of the times in 1908.
Harvard has never had a senator or anything like that, sir?
No, they did, John Kennedy, but they're not as, no, I don't think they're classified as civil servants. So, but faculty somehow are still classified as civil servants, even though they're not paid by the state. But and specifically, there's a prohibition on faculty serving. So let me just quickly give you the punchline, and then we can have the discussion about some others. Yeah. First of all, why is alumni control so effective? Well, first of all, it's nobody cares more about the institution than the alumni, right? Because if it's the sheepskin effect, right? If you are graduates of a university X, if that university goes up in the rankings, you benefit the most. And this is, for example, we were talking over coffee earlier today about what happened at BU. BU has gone up very significantly in the rankings over the past several decades, and the people who have supported that enthusiastically have been the alumni. Because suddenly the value of their sheepskin, even the value of the BU degree, is now suddenly much higher. So nobody cares about that. More importantly, nobody knows more about the institution than the alumni because they have studied there. So they know the institution, its pluses and its minuses. And nobody has more up-to-date information than the alumni because through the alumni networks they get that. And so really, for all of these reasons, both a combination of incentives and information are aligned in terms of getting them on the board. So very quickly, why is this happening? Because now we need to dig one layer below and basically see why this is happening. Now the first striking finding, if you look at the 2600-year history of universities in the world, there has never been a for-profit university that has ever amounted to anything as a research center. No great university has ever been for-profit. Why is that?
Research doesn't pay.
Research doesn't pay.
Expensive.
This is short-term thinking
Right.
in terms of return investment.
That is the classic answer, right? That is the externalities that economists love so much, right? There's a huge, there's no payoff to basic research. A mathematical formula cannot be patented. Basic laws of nature cannot be patented, right? So there is no payoff to basic research. That is one. But there is a more important reason. Not only are there consumption externalities in research, but there are production externalities. You know how that works, right? Harvard has a need-blind admissions policy. Why is that? Why does Harvard have a need-blind admission policy?
That's the top talent and
Why?
can afford
Yes, but why? Why do you want the top talent in the classroom?
To encourage the best professors to work for you.
And what else?
And to produce the best alumni who will go up and make money.
That's true, that's also true, but also because education also has production externalities. If I'm in class with you, ma'am, and you're extremely smart, I may not be so smart, but my value to a college education, to be in class with you, then that value accrues to me. So essentially, and this is something, so it's basically the group effect, right? It's the production externality as well. That having incredibly smart people around you makes the value of a college education so much higher. And it's almost like that old Groucho Marx joke, right? I would never belong to a club that would accept me. So in other words, if you take dumb rich kids, they reduce the experience, the quality of experience for everybody else. So this is something that has been recognized from the earliest times. In fact, even in the Republic, basically, Plato makes this point that education is different. There's also, so to speak, an experience good aspect to it, that students cannot evaluate the quality of their education until it's too late. That is another angle. And furthermore, as I point out in this broader paper that I'm writing, that even from the earliest days, in Nalanda, which was the great university that was founded in India in the 4th century AD, that by the way is being revived now, and I think Amartya Sen is leading that charge. There were admission tests at the door, so if you wanted to be part of the community at Nalanda, and it was totally free, it was supported by the land revenue of 200 villages, there were 6 gates, and each gate was manned by one of the 6 most prominent academics of that time, and their names are known to us because they're preserved in the Tibetan tradition, which borrowed that completely in the universities that it created, and also in the Chinese tradition, which also borrowed a lot of that. And you were given an admission test right at the gate. So the Dwar Pandit, the gate scholar, as it was called, the Pandit is also named, the gate Pandit, as it were, gave you an impromptu test right there. And the reason why that was done is because they wanted to maintain, so to speak, the production externalities. You wanted to create. And you can imagine that it must have been a formidable interview, right? That is to say, you're being interviewed by some of the greatest scholars alive before you are even allowed to go in and be part of this community of 13,000. It was a community of 10,000 students and 3,000 scholars. And even, you can imagine that most people would not even have the courage to go for an interview before these pundits, as it were. And even after they did, only 20% got through. So even after that first filtration, that you don't have a blind, you don't have an anonymous exam, you have to literally go up and face these people before you're even admitted. And the historical record shows that it's 20%. So why am I mentioning this? The reason why I'm mentioning this is that it's a for-profit university is an oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms. So therefore, if it's a for-profit university cannot exist, the profit motive cannot be the means of competition. So you have to find some other method of competition. And essentially, let me just skip this. Essentially, you have 3 models of competition. Profit in the corporate sector, power in the political sphere, and in the non-profit sector, it is competition for prestige. So the genius of American adaptation, right? America borrowed many, many things from Europe. And 13 of the 15 features that I talk about in the broader work were borrowed from Europe by America. But America adds 2 things. One is unitary governance that I talked about, and alumni governance. And that is the genius of adaptation, because what it does is that it allows for competition to flourish. And now it is the Harvard and Yale and Stanford and Princeton alumni who are competing for prestige through the boards. So it's a beautiful structure. If you think about it, if you think in terms of the ecosystem, it's a beautiful structure in that it substitutes something which is unworkable, which is competition for profit, with something that works in a non-profit context, right? We understand that in a non-profit context, you cannot be making money. In fact, you have to be subsidizing your students and your research. So the only way in which you can have competition, and that is extremely important, is by A, having many universities, and B, all of them being non-profit. They may be private or public, but they're non-profit. And let them be competing with each other, and let that competition come through the alumni. So it's the Harvard and the Yale and the Stanford and the MIT and the Princeton alums who are basically competing for the value of the sheepskin. So that is my basic thesis, and I'll just take another couple of slides to just summarize the other evidence for you. So I look at three measures, as I said: selectivity, endowment, and rank of quality. And then essentially I show that with one exception, if you regress, and I apologize, this is a little bit of a technical point, but essentially if you regress, so to speak, rank, and you can't use rank directly because because it's an ordinal measure, and so therefore you have to use logistic regression. But essentially in all three regressions, and I run it multiple ways, whether you use rank as a measure of quality, or endowment as a measure of quality, and I use log endowment, or I use logit for rank, or if you use selectivity, and I use log selectivity, one minus the percentage of people that you admit over percentage of people that you admit. That is a measure of quality, right? So if I admit 9% at Harvard, which is, I believe, the case, then it is 81 over 9, or 9. 9 is your measure of selectivity. If on the other hand I admit 20 people, then my measure of selectivity is 80 over 20, or 4, and so on. So then you can use that. And on all of these measures, it turns out that alumni percentage, these are all significant, the Z-scores, and I have those in bold for the significant numbers. The alumni percentage is very significant and of the right sign, meaning the higher the percentage of alumni on the board, the higher the rank, the higher the endowment, and higher the selectivity, with one caveat, and that is the final point that I will make, and then I will pause. And then I would love to have a broad discussion of what it means. Let me just, exclusivity or selectivity fails for the whole population. If I put in all universities, I do not get a significant coefficient on percentage of alumni. But that is to be expected. Why? Why is exclusivity not a good measure for universities as a whole?
It reduces diversity.
Not just, well, to some extent, but you can be exclusive and diverse. You can put in diversities. It's basically because of the public universities, right? The reason is that public universities actually have a percentage mandate, right? That you have to take X percent of your graduating class in the state schools, right? So if you separate out the public and the private, for private exclusivity works beautifully. And for public, it doesn't work at all, as expected. So exclusivity is not a measure of quality for public universities, is what I'm saying. And that is what the data show. So let me just pause here. This is, if you like, the sum total of the argument, and let me reiterate it here. Great universities are not for profit, but competition is still required. The competition comes in through alumni competing for prestige on the boards. That competition, plus lots of universities, plus lots of other enabling factors, is what makes America great. Whether they are public or private, religious or non-religious, most of them find a way to put alumni on the board. Interesting examples, for example, it took me a lot of time to get the data from Notre Dame, for example. Now, most of the board is selected by the Society of Jesus, right? The Jesuits, right? The Jesuit order basically selects most of the trustees of Notre Dame, and they can select anybody. It's their call, but 83%, I believe, of the trustees of Notre Dame are Notre Dame alum. Same with Brigham Young University. Same with Duke, which also is largely, most of the trustees are appointed by the Methodist Church. But they all basically find a way to appoint alumni. Same with public universities. I mentioned Purdue, I mentioned Michigan, Illinois is the same, Iowa is the same. The exceptions are those universities which have these large composite boards. They're still part of the study, they still come in. I still they're part of the regression. The numbers still come out very strong. If I exclude them, they would be even stronger, but it would not be fair to not include them. So that is my thesis, and let me just open it up for discussion here. The final thing that I'm trying to do is basically saying that this is something that other countries can learn from as well. In particular, Europe and Asia, I argue that the way in which they can move up the quality ladder, and as you know, they both face immense challenges in the university arena, this is a quick way to move up the quality ladder. So let me pause here. We have half an hour for discussion. I'm happy to take it whichever way you want. Yes?
So just a clarifying question. First of all, this is fascinating, and thank you very much for this terrific talk. A clarifying question, and then a more general question. So the clarifying one is, are you running these regressions only on the top 100 universities?
Yes.
So are there, what about the universities at the bottom? That is, are there universities at the bottom that are also alumni controlled? And if so, then is there some other factor? Yes. And that leads to the more general question, which starts at your very beginning, yes, which is when you said India had the greatest universities at the beginning, then Europe had it, then America had it. The natural thing is India and China were the richest places in the world in their age. Then Europe became the richest place and the most important place in the world. And then America was. And although it's only 25%, 25% is still a big amount of
yes,
GDP. And if you think world power, so in other words, why not the crudest, most simple economic explanation, which is great universities follow the money?
Yes, yeah, very much so. Okay, so here is the thing. So you can actually set up head-to-head tests, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can use, so I would argue that really the real measure of wealth is not just national wealth, it is per capita income, right? So essentially, if you have high per capita income, and Germany's is as high as the United States, and Switzerland's is even higher, they should be able to support at least one great university in the top 50. You don't see that. Similarly, India and China, very similar. If you look at Angus Madison's numbers from 2,000 years ago, I mean, somebody actually was foolhardy enough to speculate what per capita income was. But you know, to the best of our ability, if we can look at those numbers, they were not very different for India and China. So it is not just the national wealth which does it. It was the additional institutional innovation. And so why did that come in India? So your implicit question, if I may just hint at that, the reason why that comes is because of another innovation which occurs in India at that time, which is the Buddhist monastery. All of these institutions in India, every single one of the 9 or so major universities was Buddhist. The Hindus didn't do it, the Jains didn't do it, none of the other sects did it, it was just the Buddhists. Why? Because the whole monastic form was invented by the Buddha. And in fact, the Christian monastic tradition directly borrows a lot of it from the Buddhist monastic tradition. And it's really, to understand the Indian university system, you have to understand how the Buddhist monastery was organized, because the same thing was essentially borrowed over. And by the way, this is the reason, you know, Pawan talked about my looking into Sanskrit sources. And now I don't read Chinese, I read Sanskrit, but Chinese sources have a lot of information about the institutional governance of these entities. As lawyers, you would love it. They had voting procedures, formal voting rules in these monasteries as to how disputes would be resolved by voting. And there were rules governing what ultimately came to be called the eleemosynary corporation, which is what Harvard is, a corporation created to manage an endowment in perpetuity for public purpose. That already is occurring in India in 500 BC. So all those things basically are coming in. So coming back to your question, you have these parallels. And so you have, yes, wealth is important, but then why only India and not China? Wealth is important, so then why not great universities in France or Germany? And Germany, by the way, had those great universities, right? I mean, the whole American model, the Johns Hopkins transplant was based on Heidelberg and Berlin. And Stanford's motto even today is in German, because the great model for the American university, the research university, was a Humboldtian model from Germany. So they lost it because the institutional innovations, they couldn't keep up with the institutional innovations. So my fundamental point is, wealth is great, but institutional innovation is extremely important. Yes?
It's very interesting research. A question about the alumni control. So Harvard doesn't permit any faculty, even if they're alumni, to
Yes.
sit on the
Yes.
deciding board.
Very smart move.
Is that true with all the other elite universities in the US or no?
I don't think so. I
That's
don't think so. In fact,
Okay.
as a matter of fact, I know that in a lot of other universities, there are specific faculty slots on the board. And in my view,
Right.
that brings with it the same conflict of interest that you have when you put managers on the board of corporations.
Right. The reason I was asking was that, you know, you have, like, as an example, 10 top universities, and only one of them prohibits faculty from sitting on the board.
Right.
But they all have alumni, which means that they think that the alumni relationship is more significant as an incentive alignment device than whatever the negative effects of the faculty involvement might be.
Right.
Perception. Is there any reason to believe that in the other 9 universities, let's say, faculty can't do what the Columbia faculty apparently were doing in the early 1900s, which is, you know, paying themselves a king's ransom?
Right. So the interesting thing is that there are many universities which have faculty governance. So, for example, Oxford and Cambridge is interesting. That every academic and administrative staff member is automatically on the board of Oxford and Cambridge. So their board consists of, hold your breath, 4,000 plus individuals in each case. So when they have a real dispute, they all get together. The funny thing is that I've not been able to get data on every single one of them, but we were able to individually identify 2,700 of those 4,000. Most of them tend to be alumni of Oxford or Cambridge itself. And if this is not enough, I found, and I have to dig deeper, that until 1926, Cambridge, all the trustees were alumni. And it was a much smaller board. So how and when this happened, and Tokyo, the other top university in the top 20 that I showed, 7 out of the 8 are alumni. But they're all appointed by the state. And they're all mostly graduates of Todai, the Tokyo Law School. So I'm not sure that having such a concentration of one school is such a good thing, but that in any case, even in these other 2 centers of excellence, and by the way, you don't find this explicitly anywhere else. These are happenstances. I mean, they don't mandate alumni. They just happen to be there. The American system typically either mandates it or makes it much more likely for the alumni to sort of be participants in this. So my point of view on this is that even though these economies are growing fast or have grown fast in the case of Japan in the past, the pace of institutional innovation has not kept up. In particular, they have not paid sufficient attention to governance. You know, there's a saying in Hindi which says that 100 blows of the goldsmith are equal to 1 blow of the blacksmith. Right? The goldsmith, you can have, you know, if you're making jewelry, you make these small hammer marks, right? But the goldsmith comes in and just, wow, you know, just bangs the chain and breaks it apart. So, in my view, governance is like the hammer, is like the blacksmith, right? If you do not get the governance right, no matter what else you do, is not going to matter. If you have governance right, then you have a big advantage, and the other things become your allies, as it were, the other good things that you do. So in my view, getting the board composition right, getting governance right, getting the incentives and information flows aligned, that is the crucial part. And this is something that this audience completely understands, right? You understand governance better than anybody else, really. So there are 2 combinations that you can have in terms of forms, right? You can have for-profit universities, not-for-profit universities, and you can have private or public universities, right? So for-profit public universities are not observed, right? And that's almost like a contradiction of terms. So the other 3 forms are observed. And I didn't talk about that, but in the paper I talk about it in some detail, that the for-profit private universities attract the worst students. The bottom 10%, the bottom 20% basically go to these. Why? Because they're not really after an education, they're really after training. They want to be trained to be a dental technician. They want to be trained to be a welder. They want to be trained. So there are skill sets that you can basically develop. And the for-profit private university should really be thought of not as centers of education, but as centers of training, where they're training you for a specific skill set. Education, of course, is much broader. Now, even in the not-for-profit private, you can have three forms, right? You can have controlled by alumni, you can have controlled by self-perpetuating trust, or you can have controlled by faculty. Faculty, I showed you, it's like insider control, right? It's like insider trading. You basically turn so wherever there is faculty control, for example, in Oxford and Cambridge, there is one crucial check, which is that the state sets the salaries. So they don't have the freedom to set their own salary. So what Oxford and Cambridge dons do is that they pay themselves in kind, right? So they'll have
wine cellars,
gourmet chefs. They'll have, would you believe? I mean, maid service for your apartments. So all of these, these are these distortions. I mean, people basically say these are our traditions, quote unquote. I mean, come on. Let's be real here. I mean, these are basically ways of raiding the endowment for private benefit. So I would argue that it would be a much cleaner thing if you gave them a wine allowance and let them buy their own wine. I mean, for heaven's sake. I mean, that's rather than giving them free wine, which makes them drink too much. Much better, or giving them great food and making them eat too much. It's much better, basically, to give it to them as upfront. And if you want to eat good food, I mean, buy it yourself, make it yourself. To be honest, I don't know the short answer to the Boston area, but I can tell you that nationwide, if you look at Yale, the same pressures are at work. If you look at Princeton, the same pressures. College of William and Mary, the same pressures. And then, of course, just around this time, the land-grant colleges are coming online, right? Like your Purdue's and the Michigans of the world, your Iowas and Indianas of the world, your university system in New York is coming online. And they're also a response to this. But the interesting thing is, while they are funded in a large measure publicly, they still basically find a way to put alumni on the board. My sense is that they need not, and partly because, and for good reasons, university presidents by and large tend to be academics, most often from the same university itself, but they may not have been alums of the same university. So, case in point being President Faust, and she's not a Harvard alum. But, so therefore, my sense is that is not as important. I particularly don't care. In particular, I don't care about whether the president of the university is an alum or not, because in most cases, the president is following the guidance from the board. The high-level guidance comes from the board. So as long as the high-level guidance is coming from the alumni, whose incentives are aligned, everybody down the line will be aligned with them.
So until very recently, though, when you became a Harvard faculty member of any kind, even if you didn't go here, they gave you a Harvard degree so that everyone could be a part of the club.
That is right. And by the way, that is the standard procedure in Oxford and Cambridge as well. It used to be the standard procedure that you were given a degree so that in quote unquote you didn't feel as if you didn't belong. Right?
How recently do you mean that?
I mean, like until the 1980s, Bertie Wolfman told me that he went to Penn and he got and it just arrived in the mail and he was insulted because he thought Penn was a pretty good school. So, like until the 70s or 80s.
No, until I got one about 5 years ago.
Oh, okay.
From Harvard.
From Harvard.
Yeah.
I see.
Honorary Masters of Arts.
I see. Interesting. Oh, just a master's.
Yes.
And now that so the PhD certificate is a PhD, but not
My PhD from MIT is
it's not enough relevant. I see, not good enough. So you and then Pawan and then I'll come to you.
I happen to be an alumna
MIT, and
Yes.
I remember then President Humphrey, before she went out, they said there was tremendous pressure to give honorary degrees. And they said the people who actually earned them would probably set the buildings on fire if they gave the honorary ones for the people who went through hell to earn one.
That's right.
So it's very interesting to hear this.
It creates that problem.
Oh yes,
Doesn't it?
big time.
And in fact, the whole point about honorary degrees is that you should never use them, right? I mean, the whole point, I mean, if you have an honorary doctorate, you shouldn't go around parading that you're a doctor, right? That's the real doctor. It's interesting that that tension, by the way, so if I may just go one level deeper even than what you're saying, right? The thing that I didn't highlight is that the whole process of knowledge production is deeply elitist, right? The whole, it's the most elite thing that is known to mankind, in my view, right? Because, and the reason, and it's a paradox, that to create a public good, right? All the research when it gets published is a public good. To create the ultimate public good, which is completely egalitarian, you can go on the internet and read any paper, right? Or get access to any paper. But to create that public good, the ultimate public good, you're creating the ultimate exclusionary society. You know, through your admissions policies, through your hiring policies, through your promotion policies. So most of the people would not even dare apply here. They would not even come to the gate pundit, right? To basically say, please examine my credentials. Most people would say, it's not even worth it, I'm not going to get in. And of those who have the temerity to do so, only a small fraction get in. That is elitism. So in some sense, what you are describing is not just Columbia and Harvard, or Columbia and the United States. The point is that knowledge production is deeply elitist. And you cannot get away from it for the two reasons that I mentioned, right? It's a consumption externality, but more importantly, it's a production externality. My interaction in this environment is much more valuable because you're smart. And you've gone through the filter which says that you only belong to this community if you come up to a certain level of smartness. So in fact, what you're saying, I completely agree with that. But I argue that it's not just the United States versus Columbia. It is great educational institutions, period. That's the fundamental fact. I've been presenting this now all over the world, and I'm saying that this is a way to dramatically raise the caliber and the quality and the responsiveness and the endowments of institutions in Europe and Asia and Latin America and indeed anywhere else for that matter. That this is a model just as, so we should not be afraid to copy great institutional innovations. America itself did, right? America itself copied a whole variety. I mean, they took the template of a modern research university from Europe and added, some uniquely American features like alumni governance. And we, in turn, should absolutely rush to borrow some of these procedural and governance innovations. So that is one point. Yes, so that is the reason why I had three measures. It doesn't dominate the outcome, but you're absolutely right. Wait, let me show you. I have this slide here. Yeah. So about 20, so yeah. So reputation amongst high school counselors is what they look at. And peer reputation. So if you add the two, it's 22.5. So it's 22.5%. That is why I think rank on those, that is why I have endowment and selectivity as harder measures. So you're absolutely right. You zeroed in on a key defect of these rankings is that about a quarter of the weight is how you're perceived to be. So you can be perceived to be of quality when you're not of quality. And that sort of perpetuates itself. So that's a real danger. That's why I have the other two measures, is the short answer.
Thank you.
Any final set of questions?
We could do this all day, but I think that's what I was. Thank you.